The story of Bright Star is set in 1818. It is about the romantic relationship between the handsome poet John Keats and the passionate Fanny Brawne. Fanny Brawne is a fashionable young woman who resides in Hampstead Village, London. She likes making her own clothes, no matter how strange they may seem. She has a good eye for detail and a vibrant personality. The Brawne family is close to the Dilke family. They invite them to their home to meet the young poet John Keats. There, Fanny meets his best friend, Charles Armitage Brown. The man describes Fanny as very well stitched, noticing her strange outfit. But when he greets her, she decides not to shake his hand and leaves him hanging. Charles asks Fanny what he has done to receive such cold treatment. Fanny tells him she does not shake hands with the enemy. Charles does not understand what she means, asking her what he has done to her. Fanny tells him he does nothing to her, or for her, and that is how she would like things to be between them. In fact, Fanny is offended by the way Charles speaks of her style. Charles exclaims that he does not know anything about fashion, so Fanny says she feels the same way about his poetry. She does not know what his verses mean. Charles's poems irritate her. John did not join the guests because he did not feel good. So, Mrs. Dilke asks Fanny to take tea to John. Charles tells them that John is busy writing and he should not be disturbed. Fanny thinks Charles is the expert when it comes to disturbing others. Fanny is not very good with people, so she tells them she is merely praising Charles, but her family worries she might offend John, who they hold in high regard. Fanny takes the tea to John, and before she goes to his room, she makes sure she looks presentable for the handsome writer. John pulls the door open and surprises Fanny. She ends up spilling his tea. Fanny laughs, telling John that he likes joking around, just like her. She tells him that the only person who does not appreciate her jokes is Charles, who thinks she only cares about fashion. John sits down and holds his book in his hands. He does not look keen on speaking to Fanny, and is, in fact, how Mrs. Dilke described him, in poor spirits. Fanny asks if John would like some biscuits, but he tells her she has come to spy on him. He assumes she is interested in learning about his character, but she tells him she does not care about it. John thinks maybe his fashion is more interesting to her, but she tells him he needs a new jacket. She is sure about her advice because she is a fashion expert who designs and sews her own clothes. Charles enters John's room and asks if Fanny has annoyed John sufficiently. Charles kicks her out of the room, but before she leaves, she tells them that her stitching is more brilliant than their scribblings put together, and she can make money from it. Charles is surprised by that, while John laughs, calling her minstress. Fanny's younger brother, Samuel, goes out to purchase John's book Endymion for Fanny. The bookshop owner tells him the book has not received good reviews, and he has not sold one copy. Fanny's sister, Toots, tells him her older sister wanted to read the book for herself to determine if the poet is an idiot or not. Fanny takes John's book and asks her sister to read it. Fanny listens to the first few lines of a poem and asks Toots to stop. Fanny takes the book herself and reads it alone. She falls back in her bed, examining John's poems. Fanny is invited to a ball and uses it as an opportunity to speak to John. Fanny recites one of his verses. John remarks that she actually read his book. Fanny tells him she wanted to adore it, but she can't say if she hates it or not. John insists that she tells him the truth. Fanny is not afraid to speak up her mind, but she thinks she is not clever with poetry. John is no longer aloof, he jokes, telling her that it seems he is just like her. Apparently not clever with it either, but he is hopeful. Fanny believes that hope does not necessarily create results, but practice might. Like stitching, she got better at it after practicing a lot. While Fanny's dance card is full, John, on the other hand, does not like dancing and refuses to interact with others. Fanny notices how sad he looks and asks him if his brother, Tom, is doing better. But John is no bearer of good news. He is very concerned for his brother's health. Fanny shares with him the death of her father, who was very ill before he passed away. A man comes to take Fanny's hand to dance, and John lets her go. Fanny tries to bring comfort to a dying man. She goes to visit John's brother, accompanied by her brother and sister. She knocks on John's door. Inside, he and Charles seem to have had a long night of writing, and the room looks like a mess. Charles asks Fanny to leave whatever she brought outside, but Fanny insists on seeing John. The latter asks Charles to invite her inside. As Fanny enters the room, Charles steals one of the biscuits she prepared for John. She calls Charles a disgusting ape. He hears this and starts acting like one, screaming and running around. Before Charles manages to take another one, she hits him and threatens to bite him if he comes near her again. John tells Charles to be careful because she has sharp teeth. She has sunk her fangs into his poor poems and torn them apart. Fanny is sorry about that and reveals that she thought the beginning of his poem was perfect. John does not want Fanny to leave. He asks her to stay because he and Charles are monkeys who obviously need company and inspiration. But Fanny is not interested in that. John goes after her, thinking that her visit might cheer his brother up. Fanny does not care about asking her mother's permission to be a little late. She asks her brother and sister to stay with her as she walks ahead with John. Fanny is amazed by John's ability to tolerate Charles's craziness. Fanny believes that wit and fashion are two things she prefers in people, and that is why she is not a big fan of Charles, because he lacks both. John starts speaking poorly of the people Fanny is talking about, and she thinks John is particularly targeting her and attacking her with words. John tells her that he is merely defending Charles's generous heart. John apologizes and takes her to his brother. Fanny finds John's brother in bad shape. The young boy is delusional and desperate to feel the warmth of his brother. Toots tells Fanny that she wants to leave because the place smells bad, but Fanny instantly threatens her to cut her hair at night if she speaks another word. Fanny watches John take care of his brother and feels bad for both of them. The next time John and Fanny meet, she asks him about his brother, hoping he is doing better, but John does not want to talk about Tom. He surprises her with his indifference, but she respects his wishes. Soon after, the Brauns receive the news of Tom's death. Fanny is heartbroken and runs up the stairs to her room to work on something she wants to give John. She finished it in one night. When Fanny meets John, she gives him a pillow slip, and John plans to rest Tom's head upon it. Before John leaves Fanny's house, he asks her to invite him again, but alone next time. Fanny tells her mother they should expect John to spend Christmas with them. The Brauns are very excited about that. Charles reminds John that the Reynolds have already invited them for Christmas. Fanny tells Toots that Charles wants John all to himself, and that is why he does not want him to be close to them. Charles tries to defend himself, but Fanny does not want to hear anything coming from him. She leaves the room in the middle of their conversation. Mrs. Braun receives a letter from John asking her if her invitation is still available. Fanny is happy to hear about his return and wears something nice for dinner. She asks him to teach her poetry because she would like to understand it and she doesn't know how to begin. John proves to be an interesting guest and amuses the Brauns with things he has seen in Scotland. Toots asks John for a short poem. John thinks for a moment and starts speaking what is on his mind. His verses impress everyone, but then he pauses when he goes blank. When everyone leaves, John touches Fanny's hand, exploring what his feelings are dictating. Fanny goes to see John for her poetry class, but finds Charles with him. They pretend as if Charles is not there, but the latter listens to them, trying to contain his smile. He finally asks if Fanny is serious about poetry because he can't recognize her anymore. He can't believe that she is interested in poetry. Before Charles leaves the room, he makes fun of her ambition. Fanny is more comfortable alone with John. John tells her about the craft of poetry and thinks it should come naturally to poets. John takes back his offer and tells Fanny maybe he should not teach her because he does not have the right feelings for women. John is suspicious of his feelings, so Fanny asks if he doesn't like her. John confesses that he is attracted to her without knowing why. John is confused by women, and he finds that funny. He tells her that the feeling of writing a poem is like diving in a lake. Its purpose is not to swim straight back to the shore but to luxuriate in the sensation of the water, and to stay in it as long as possible. Fanny should not think too much about understanding the feeling, she should just feel it instead. Just as Fanny gains more knowledge about poetry, John, on the other hand, finds inspiration in their talks. Fanny tells her mother that John is brilliant, but she is not sure he likes her. Her mother thinks that John has no income, so it must be the reason why he is not pursuing her. Fanny is disappointed when she hears that John is sick and won't be teaching her. Charles tells her to stay anyway. He asks her about how her reading is going and discovers that she has read a lot in 1 week, including everything that John has written. Charles is amazed by her ambition, but he still behaves obnoxiously around Fanny. A letter comes to Fanny, and it is from Charles. The Valentine letter annoys her since the words he used are out of place. Outside Fanny's house, John is behaving oddly, standing under the rain. John asks if she has really received the letter. Fanny tells him it is probably a joke. John quickly runs away. Charles behind him calls his name, but John does not look back. Fanny follows them both into the woods. John believes that Charles has encouraged him to recover alone so he can win Fanny. John does not look well. He screams at his friend and asks about his intentions. Charles says that it is only a joke, but John remarks that no one is laughing. Charles tries to show John Fanny's true colors, accusing her of being a flirt, and that this is all a game to her. To stop his friend's attacks, John pushes Charles against a tree and asks him to respect the holiness of affection because he should not take it lightly. John walks back to Fanny and asks her if she is in love with Charles. At first, Fanny does not answer, but after they both pressure her for answers, she leaves. John looks at her figure in the distance and decides to follow her. Fanny does not accept John's apology. After some time, Fanny comes back around and visits John, bringing him flowers. Samuel tells John that they are going to stay next door. Everyone is excited about that, but Charles. He sees Fanny as a distraction. Now that they are living close, Charles gathers everybody to give them instructions about how he and John should not be disturbed when working. John hears Fanny's movements from the other end of the wall. He knocks on it, and she does the same, both feeling each other's presence without seeing or touching one another. John and Fanny are now close. They go on long walks and explore nature together. John tells Fanny about his dream, in which he kissed someone. Although he can't remember who, he can't forget the lips. Fanny is curious to know if it's her lips John dreamt about. John gets closer to her and gives her a kiss. On their way back, John and Fanny hold hands and kiss secretly. Toots is suspicious that something is going on between them, but they try to hide it. John seems much more inspired and lively. He is amazed by life and nature every day. Charles is worried for his friend because he is afraid that his involvement with Fanny is going to rob him of his freedom. John thinks that Fanny is the best thing that has happened to him, and that is the reason why he is writing again. His feelings for Fanny have opened new doors of creativity. His happiness paves the way for great poems, which he shares with Charles. Fanny finds the two poets working and sits in the back to watch them write. Fanny learns that Charles is doing his summer rental, which means he and John will be leaving. As Charles explains to her where they are planning to go, Fanny opens the door and leaves the room. John finds her crying and tells her that he has no money, which is why he should write to make a living. John believes that if he fails to support himself, he would love for Fanny to spend her life happily with another man, who will adore and cherish her as he does. Fanny screams that she hates John because she can't imagine herself with another man. Fanny is heartbroken and depressed. Every day, she expects a letter from John and is disappointed to hear nothing from him. She wonders if she is in love and asks her mother if this is what love means. Now that she knows what it feels like, she promises never to tease anybody for it again. At last, Fanny receives news of John. He tells her about how he spends his days and describes his miserable state being apart from her, and wishes they could be butterflies so they can fly away joyfully. Fanny feels happy hearing such beautiful words from the poet. She kisses it all the time and decides to write back. Fanny had spent 5 days in her bedroom, completely dejected. But upon hearing from John, she was back up again. She began a butterfly farm in her room to honor his letter. Fanny's mother is concerned about the state of her daughter. Fanny's room is full of butterflies, and she only feels alive when she receives John's letters. In the meantime, everything around her feels fake because he is not a part of it. Fanny sends Toots to the kitchen to get her a knife. The worried mother asks Toots why Fanny needs it, and she tells her Fanny wants to take. Fanny is sitting on the ground crying her eyes out because things with John have come to an end. John is ashamed that he has not made a fortune, but Fanny does not care about money, she only wants him. All the butterflies are now dead because Fanny has stopped caring for anything. Charles is back at his house, and Fanny is sent by her mother to introduce the maid, Abigail, to him. Fanny is curious to know if John is coming back, but Charles assures her that John has decided to stay in London. Soon later, John visits the Bronze. They share a normal conversation as if they had never been apart. John gives Fanny a special ring, his mother's. He also plans to move in next door again, but Fanny's mother and Mrs. Dilk are afraid that John won't be able to support Fanny since his intentions are very clear. And in case they get married, they fear that she will spend the rest of her life in poverty. Fanny wears the ring on a different finger in front of her mother, afraid that she might object to John's moving in with Charles. Every time Fanny shows up, Charles leaves the room. John and Fanny are deeply in love. He writes poems about his love for her. Everything is fine until one day when John comes back from a short trip, looking seriously ill. He tells Charles that he feels something is wrong with him. Alarmed by this, Charles wakes up the maid and asks her to prepare a warm bath for John. Fanny hears this and goes inside Charles's place to help him. Fanny discovers a towel full of blood and is immediately scared, knowing it belongs to John. Charles believes that John needs to be away from Fanny to recover. So, he lies to his friend and tells him she went downtown. Fanny does not approve of this and visits John, who is severely unwell. John is kept indoors. He sees Fanny through the window and writes her letters to send his love. Charles does everything in his power to separate the two, thinking her presence makes him sicker. Fanny pushes her bed against the wall to be close to him. Through a letter, John tells Fanny that he is recommended not to read or write poetry because that might worsen his condition. He thinks she should explore more options instead of lingering by his side. Fanny visits John to demand answers from him, and he tells her that he has coughed blood again. John feels like his disease has already won, but Fanny is hopeful that he will stay alive, and that his second poetry collection will be a success. The maid gives Fanny a letter, which he had instructed her to give to her the next day. The maid looks horrible and tells Fanny that Charles is the cruelest man she has ever known. Charles tells John that the maid is pregnant, but he does not mention the identity of the father. John thinks they should search for him. Charles tells John that the maid thinks he is the father. John is surprised to hear that, but Charles deeply suspects that it might be true. Charles is indebted to a lot of people, and now that he will take care of the maid's child, he is afraid he can't take care of John anymore. Fanny hears that John is recommended to move somewhere else with a better climate. Charles tells his friends that John does not have the money to move to Rome or anywhere else, so they suggest starting a fund for John. One of the men thinks John will need a companion, so they assume that Charles would be suitable for such a role. Fanny listens to all of this with tearful eyes. Once Fanny and John are alone, she expresses her wish to accompany him to Italy. Fanny finds where John is staying. He was ashamed to show her, but she insisted on seeing his room for herself. 5 weeks later, Fanny still can't give up on her love for John. She can't forget him no matter how hard she tries. Toots discovers the body of a man in the backyard and calls Fanny. She goes closer to the man and finds that it is John. He looks frantic and tells her that his heart has been in pain ever since he left before he finally faints. They hold him up the stairs as he coughs severely and call for a doctor. Fanny asks her mother to invite John to stay with them until he leaves for Italy. Her mother is concerned by that because they are not engaged, and she is also afraid that Fanny might get married to John and leave with him for Rome. Her mother regrets ever moving in close to John. Her daughter is already a source of gossip and is afraid that might ruin her reputation. Fanny confronts her mother and asks her what could happen if she and John get engaged. John shows signs of recovery and is expected to leave for Naples in a couple of weeks. Although he coughs from time to time, he looks a little healthier and is glad that Fanny is with him at all times. John published his second book, which received mixed reviews. Fanny is very proud of him, and her mother asks John to stay with them and marry Fanny, because she accepts him into their life now. Fanny is moved to tears by how much her family loves John, but the latter still decides to leave. Fanny cries in John's arms, telling him that there must be another life because they can't be created for this kind of suffering. John holds her tightly and kisses her. He tells her that he doubts they will see each other again on this earth, but Fanny can't understand why he is leaving. John's friends have already paid for his trip and he can't refuse them. Fanny suggests that he could tell them he is ill, but John tells her that their existence is beyond this world because they are in another one, of their own invention. Fanny can't be without him, but John tells her he has a conscience and he can't give her hope. John and Fanny imagine how their life would be in case he returned. They lie in bed and hold each other's hands. He touches her face because touch has a memory, and that is how they decide to remember each other. John tells Fanny that they should not speak a word to one another on the day of his departure, and that is indeed what happened. Fanny accompanied him to the carriage and left without a single word out of her mouth. Charles is back with Abigail and their baby. Charles tells Fanny that John reached Naples, and he has written to him. Fanny reproaches Charles for leaving his friend when he most needed him. Charles asks Fanny if he should say aloud what she is thinking because it might bring her satisfaction. Then, he starts screaming that he failed John Keats over and over again, as his baby is crying in the background. A letter comes to Fanny's mother from John, telling her that Italy looks like a dream. Charles looks outside his window, watching Fanny and her siblings. He particularly focuses on Fanny. His eyes shine with a hidden emotion he can't decide. As Samuel is playing the violin in the living room, Fanny is sewing. They all stop what they are doing when Charles enters the room. He announces the news of John's death, shocking everyone. He asks if they are ready to hear what John's companion Severin had to say in his letter, and Fanny nods impatiently. John died on Friday, the 23rd of February. John asked Severin to lift him up because he was passing away. He asked him not to be frightened and thanked God that it had come. At one point, a cold sweat broke out all over John's body, and he suddenly passed. Fanny could not bear hearing details about John's death. She stops Charles and leaves the room. Charles watches her leave with a tortured expression. Fanny cries out loud, not knowing what to do with herself. She breaks down at the end of the stairs and calls for her mother. She hits her chest, telling her mother she is so hurt she can't breathe. In the last scene of the movie, we see that Fanny has made herself a black dress. She stands in front of the mirror and starts cutting her hair. Her locks fall on the floor, and she exits the room quietly. She puts on a hat and leaves the house. Samuel goes after her as she ventures into the woods, murmuring John's verses with a heavy heart and eyes full of tears. Fanny never forgot John or removed his ring.